Thank you, everyone. Thank you for so quickly and efficiently grabbing your tea and coffee and coming back in. We're thrilled today to have three sets of speakers who will be giving tributes to Dr. Stone, sharing some personal reflections of their interaction with her over her long-time involvement with the Society. I came to know John and Nancy fairly late in the piece. It must have been in Adelaide in 2016, which was my first conference, where I met them both, and I had the distinct honour and privilege of looking after them over the course of that weekend. I'm not going to say too much now because I want to leave time for our speakers, the first of which is the Honourable Dyson Heydon, who's come down from Sydney. The judge gave an excellent paper in Perth at the retirement of John and Nancy from their active duties in running the Society, chronicling not only John's but also Nancy's involvement with the Society and their distinguished contributions to Australian society. He'll be followed by Alison Copeman, who got to know both John and Nancy very well through both the Society and our sister organisation, the H.R. Nichols Society. And then following Alison, we'll hear from Bob Day and Joy Montgomery, who had the challenge and the privilege of standing in John and Nancy's shoes when they did retire after some 20 years running the Society, acting as at the time, purely voluntary secretariat. And I know now, and I have a team of 5 staff, how much work is involved in running the conference, running the organisation, and everything else. And Bob and Joy carried that burden for a long time and with great distinction. So they'll share some reflections as well about that transitional period. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Dyson Heydon.
Thank you very much. Nancy Enid Hardwick was born on the 16th of June 1929. She was brought up in a small settlement in the Western Australian wheat belt. Like many rural children in those days, she had her initial education in a one-teacher school. Years later, she won a bursary to the University of Western Australia at the same time as John Stone, whose background was similar. They met in 1947 and became betrothed in 1951. She graduated Bachelor of Science with first-class honours and a Master of Science. She gained a Hackett Scholarship to work for the degree of philosophy in the field of biochemistry at Cambridge. That challenging enterprise was successfully completed shortly after she married John in 1954. In 1959, they had a daughter, and then in fairly quick succession, 4 sons, the last of whom were twins. Until John left the Treasury in 1984, they lived primarily in Canberra. In many of those Canberra years, Nancy worked at the Australian National University, but the unpredictable whims of John's stern taskmasters in the Treasury led to lengthy stays in London twice and in Washington, D.C. After 1984, they lived in Melbourne and then Sydney in a beautiful farmhouse, former farmhouse, at Lane Cove, where incidentally Nancy revealed herself to be an excellent and generous cook. She had great mental powers, not only in science, but allied to them were considerable skills of practical organisation. These are what it must have taken to work at the ANU while raising 5 energetic and vigorous children. Canberra in those days was not well endowed with services for young working mothers. The success of Nancy and John as parents is evidenced by the intellectual power and probity of their children. But to Nancy must go the greater credit, for the inhuman working hours demanded of a harassed and ill-remunerated official, rising fast up the Treasury ladder, can have left John with little time in which to assist Nancy with child-rearing. In later years, there have been many beloved grandchildren and great-grandchildren whose birthdays Nancy always faithfully remembered and generously acknowledged. The post-Treasury years were not years of idleness. They were the years of the Senate, of journalism, of the Institute of Public Affairs, the H.R. Nichols Society, Inc., and above all, the Samuel Griffith Society. For both John and Nancy, those activities took time. For John, they involved the revelation or criticism of public apathy. John's approach, in his own words, was boots and all. The recipients of his frank opinions about them did not always take the bad news in a friendly way. In contrast, Nancy was to both John and to the victims sympathetic, serene, calming and soothing. Those qualities helped to soften the impact of John's pragmatism and bluntness. She saved him from many potential fights. Her soft answers turned away wrath. When people of achievement die, it's hackneyed to say, as was said in St Paul's Cathedral on the death of Sir Christopher Wren, if you want a monument for him, look around. But hackneyed or not, it is certainly true of Nancy. For the Samuel Griffith Society owes Nancy a great debt. In the days before the Society lost its amateur status, so to speak, and turned professional, there were numerous clerical or administrative jobs to be done, which were done by her. Above all, if John became discouraged about progress, Nancy would lift his spirits. John once said, "Whatever small things I may or may not have achieved, the one thing I do know is that none of them would have been achieved without her." That is true, save that John Stone's achievements are not small, either in number or quality. The day will come when the world recognises his greatness as controversialist, polemicist and publicist. On that day, it will appreciate the vital role he has performed in puncturing the follies and false pieties of the present age. When that day comes, her joint role in achieving that success will also be recognised. The Stones shared high intelligence, independence and integrity. To these qualities, Nancy added her gentleness, friendliness, courtesy and good sense. She was kind to the wretched and the despised ones of the earth. She had all the aristocratic virtues, but she had no vices of any kind. On the 31st of July, at her express wish, her funeral was conducted according to the 1662 prayer book by an Anglican priest. The funeral was at St John's Anglican Church, Ashfield, which is an attractive building set in a peaceful park. During the service, through the dignified and solemn words of Cranmer and of the King James's Bible, could be heard the happy cries of young children playing in the park. At its end, the mourners came out into the glorious late afternoon sunshine of winter. The beauty of the scene matched the beauty of Nancy's nature. All who knew her would agree that it was an incomparable boon to have known that most gracious, decent and dignified soul, Nancy Stone.
I was very honoured when Xavier phoned me and asked if I would participate in the tributes to Nancy Stone as part of this conference. I think of Nancy Stone as one of the founders of the Samuel Griffith Society. It was all her very hard work and help to John which kept the society going in those early years. These are my own personal recollections. As the Queen said, recollections may vary. In 1986, my husband Charles told me he wished me to go to Melbourne with him, and I was not told why. He took me to the CWA hostel in Toorak, where a group of people were getting together, and that weekend the H.R. Nichols Society was formed. There I met Nancy and John Stone. From some of the papers produced for the Society in future meetings, there was a suggestion that a new society should be started upholding the Australian Constitution and federalism. In 1992, the first conference of the Samuel Griffith Society was held. Nancy and John Stone were very much involved in the early years. They became the pillars of this society. They were living in Melbourne. I was blessed that Charles asked me to attend the conference with him, and he so looked forward to the Samuel Griffith Conference every year. He was so happy to be with like-minded people and to hear such interesting papers, which were very different from his close involvement of industrial relations. At every meeting, Nancy was always there to greet us all. She and John had done so much work to organise the speakers. Nancy had all the name tags ready, and she seemed to know everyone who attended the conference. She acted as the secretary of the society. The success of the running of the conference was due to Nancy's very hard work. Sir Harry Gibbs was the first chair of the society. He came regularly with Lady Gibbs, who was in a wheelchair. Nancy would be there looking after Lady Gibbs and making sure that she was comfortable. After each conference, all the papers were put in a book and published. I imagine Nancy was the one, with John's help, to put the papers together and take them to the publisher. John reported to us all that Nancy had all the books piled up on their dining room table in Melbourne, and then I imagine it was Nancy's job to go and post them out to all the members. I remember well the conference in Perth when Nancy and John gave up their immediate role in running the society. Nancy was especially thanked for the wonderful work which she had done for us all. They still attended future conferences, and they would finally sit together while others did the heavy work. I watched the private remarks that they would make to each other during the papers, and John would, of course, regularly have interesting questions. Nancy and John moved to Sydney, and we were able to catch up with them more often then. After Charles died, I finally became a member of the society myself, and I attended the conferences and the occasional Sydney functions. I was so fortunate that Nancy would always come up and greet me when I arrived on my own. She was a great comfort to me, as I knew few of the younger and newer members. Just last year at the conference in Sydney, when I also stayed in the hotel in Brighton where they were staying, Nancy would invite me to have breakfast and lunches with them. To listen to the papers now, Nancy would now sit in the front row to make sure that she never missed a word. I was so blessed to be at the celebration of Nancy's life, which was held at that lovely old church in Ashfield. I sat with my Samuel Griffith friends. We heard from John how Nancy did not want a eulogy. She had listened to so many. But John felt he wanted us to know what a wonderful person she was as a wife and a mother. She'd grown up in the country and went on to have such a very successful life with her own work after finishing a PhD at Cambridge. She brought up 5 very successful children and followed John around the world for his work. The 5 children also spoke at this celebration of Nancy's life, as they said they wanted us to know what a very special mother she had been to each one of them. And they told us how she kept in touch with them, emailing regularly wherever they were living, right up until the end of her life. The church was filled with their wonderful 18 grandchildren. As well as her busy family and work life, Nancy still had time to give so much of herself to the Samuel Griffith Society. We were very blessed to have Nancy Stone as one of the founders of our society, and we owe her a great debt. Thank you, dear Nancy.
Well, good morning, everyone. Nancy and I stayed in touch right until just before she died. I write a regular party newsletter and blog post, and Nancy would often respond with a comment or two. But most of all, Nancy liked my jokes. She had a wonderful sense of humour, which I discovered when I was given the regular Sunday morning spot of the Society's conferences. I was given the chairman of the Sunday morning, and I'm keen to get the sessions off to a good start on a Sunday morning, particularly after some very late nights with Ray Evans and John Stone and Stuart Wood and a few others. I'd always start the Sunday morning session with a joke, and being a regular churchgoer myself, and it being Sunday morning, the jokes always had a religious theme. And Nancy had two favourites, which she often mentioned to me later. The first one was about the minister who, every time he got up to the pulpit, would say to the congregation, "The Lord be with you," to which they all responded, "And also with you." But on one occasion, just before he got up to the pulpit, he was told the microphone wasn't working. So when he got up, he sort of tapped the microphone and said, "There's something wrong with this," to which they all responded, "And also with you." Her second favourite was the story of Joseph of Arimathea, who was the wealthy businessman who donated his own tomb for Jesus' burial. And when the news of this very generous gesture reached Joseph's business colleagues, they all formed a delegation and went to see him and said, "Joseph, are you sure you know what you're doing, giving your tomb to this Jesus of Nazareth? Your tombs are very valuable and yours is the best one in the cemetery." He said, don't worry, he said, "It's only for the weekend." When Joy and I took over the secretariat from John and Nancy, I must confess it was a very daunting task, not least of which because Sir Harry Gibbs was their chairman and Ian Callanan was our chairman, both High Court judges. No pressure. And most of you here would know how boards of directors works and the relationship that exists between the secretary and the chairman, preparing agendas, minutes of previous meetings, financial reports, arranging AGMs, election of office bearers, distribution of the proceedings book, which Alison just mentioned. Everything had to be absolutely spot on. Checking and double-checking everything for the chairman to make sure everything went smoothly would keep you up at night. That is, keep Joy up at night. So I'll just hand over to Joy and tell us a bit more.
Thank you for the opportunity to just play a very small part in honouring Nancy Stone. John and Nancy were a force together. They were a team. They were a working couple. And their devotion and their affection to each other was evident whenever I saw them. When they handed over the secretary duties to Bob and I, everything was done by hand, but it was meticulously done and systematic. Initially, John and Nancy met with us to explain the role. They told us that it wasn't a huge job and that it wouldn't take very much time each week. They certainly underestimated the amount of time that they dedicated to both the task and the society. Nancy had produced a document which she entitled Duties of the Secretary, and it outlined in detail the general duties and responsibilities and then the specific activities month by month. Nancy was a strong and gracious and gentle woman, and it's evidenced in the first few paragraphs of her general duties explanation. For those of you who knew Nancy, I'm sure that as I read these few paragraphs, you'll be able to imagine and picture her saying these words. The following is an outline of the way the Society has been run in recent years, As will be evident, it has been done very much by hand. For major word processing, especially but not only the book, we have employed a delightful, generous and helpful young woman, Ruth Wilson, who works from our Geelong home. She was previously an employee of the Wares Group, who deal with our major mail-outs and whose headquarters are in Coburg, Victoria. The society has been run in a thrifty manner, which perhaps may seem almost embarrassingly frugal to modernise. We do not have credit card facilities. Small mail-outs of 100 or so letters have been done by myself personally, using address labels prepared by Ruth. We have what must be an antique postal franking machine, which works well, but drives the Australia Post officials wild when they have to recharge it. The list goes on. A new team will undoubtedly spot many areas for improvement. It is, of course, the duty of the Secretary to arrange meetings of the board from time to time by telephone hookup, thanks nowadays to the generosity of Bob Day. Her generous and gracious nature shows in the very words that she used in those descriptions. But the thing that often made me smile to myself were how she described those who hadn't renewed their membership in a timely manner as chronically unfinancial members or recalcitrant members, and how she was perhaps overindulgent in allowing these members to stay on the list for 2 years. All her words that she'd put in her general duties document. In Proverbs, there is a description of a woman of noble character, and I think Nancy fits that description extremely well. Here is just a sample of some of those characteristics. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She sets about her work vigorously. She opens her arms to the poor and extends hers to the needy. Her husband is respected. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. Her children arise and call her blessed, and her husband praises her. I'm sure that you can put all of those words to who Nancy was. In the time and the generation that Nancy lived, the majority of her life, I suspect it didn't really support women with her strength and intelligence in the way that we are so fortunate to have now. I wonder how much greater her influence would have been in today's society. Having said that, her legacy is evident in the fact that she's been honoured today. Thank you for allowing us to share as we honour Nancy in this special way today.
Being secretary of the Samuel Griffith Society was never a chore, it was never a burden, it was an honour and a privilege. I've been secretary or chairman of lots of organisations in my life. Hanging around with Ray Evans, there's never a shortage of organisations to be secretary, isn't that right, Hugh? Yeah. But there was none like Nancy Stone. I wouldn't say this about too many people, but Nancy is as close to perfect as a person I've ever met. Nancy and John Stone laid the foundation, a very strong foundation for the secretarial workings of the Samuel Griffith Society, a foundation that the rest of us have confidently built upon. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Well, that concludes this morning's morning tea. Apologise, I didn't expect to get so emotional, but I hope you all can agree just how powerful and significant those tributes were, and just how much of a privilege it has been to be able to hear those reflections. Nancy meant so much to so many of us. She and John meant a great deal to me as well. And I certainly don't believe I would be here and doing this job that I love so very much were it not for them and their contributions. So thank you all for making the time this morning to share in these tributes. I'm going to give you all 5 or 10 minutes now to use the restrooms if you need, to mix and mingle and get a glass of water or tea or coffee. But if you could be back here at 11:15 for the Sir Harry Gibbs oration, I would be very grateful if you could be there in your seats at 11:15. Thank you.